Undercover boss orders coffee at local diner stops cold when waitress says tips don't even buy lunch. Ethan Carter, 50 years old, CEO of the Sunrise Coffeehouse chain, walked into a local cafe, not in a neatly tailored suit, but in a simple gray shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of old worn leather shoes. He chose midday, the hottest and busiest hour of the city, to witness firsthand how employees served customers when no upper management was around. The harsh sunlight pierced through the old glass window, reflecting off the weathered wooden table, casting patchy streaks of light like the faded memories of this coffee shop. He pulled out a wooden chair with a slightly wobbly back, leaving behind a squeaking sound that echoed in the already quiet space. Even the clinking of a coffee spoon against the cup sounded unnervingly clear. A stifling heat wafted in from the street outside, thickening the air in the cafe, making every glance seem more suspicious. The eyes of scattered customers around the shop flicked toward him, a stranger with a modest appearance. Unlike the usual patrons who frequented the cafe with shiny watches and expensive leather bags, he sat down, rested his elbows on the rough table, and was about to place an order when the door to the counter swung open. Linda Walker, the shift manager, emerged, her eyes quickly scanning Ethan before stopping. She stood, tall arms folded across her chest, lips pressed together as if suppressing a wave of annoyance. Her voice rang out, light as a summer breeze, but carrying a sharp blade within. "This seat is reserved for regular customers." The short, crisp sentence left a cold silence hanging in the already suffocating air. Linda's eyes scanned Ethan from head to toe, stripping away the faded shirt and worn-out jeans he wore, and in her mind flickered a bitter thought. People who look like him are usually not welcome here. She didn't need to say it out loud. The thought lingered in her gaze, a look that was both challenging and dismissive. Sunlight streamed through the patchy window, casting Ethan's silent silhouette motionless, yet his eyes were like a still lake waiting for a breeze to stir. Outside, the noise of traffic rolled by like waves crashing on the shore, but inside the cafe space was eerily quiet. A few customers paused their coffee spoons, tilting their heads to follow the brief exchange. The earlier murmurs of conversation died down, leaving only the sound of waiting breaths, and eyes focused on the man sitting there, as if waiting for him to respond or to lower his head and leave. Ethan didn't flinch. His gaze remained calm, deep, as if he were used to situations like this, where people judged him only by his appearance, only by a brandless shirt, only by the color of his skin or the style of his hair. He lightly tapped his fingers on the table. His breath was slow and steady. His eyes were patient and unwavering. Because he knew that every story was only just beginning, and every word, every cold glance, every chair that was not for people like him, it was an opening sentence to a truth that needed to be exposed. Ethan remained seated, his back straight, his hand lightly resting on the old wooden chair. His gaze swept across the room, calm but carrying a quiet determination. Under the sunlight streaming through the window pane, his simple appearance seemed to highlight his composure all the more. Not a hint of haste, not a single word of protest. Linda, standing before him, hesitated slightly when Ethan's eyes met hers. Her voice suddenly sharpened, carrying a thinly veiled challenge that only the perceptive could detect. "We don't serve people who can't be trusted." The tone of that sentence wasn't loud, but it struck like a cold blade. Each word peeled away the mask that had long been hidden behind the cafe's sweet invitations. A few customers nearby looked up, their eyes shifted between Ethan and Linda. Some glances were sympathetic, others curious and dismissive. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit cleared his throat, tapping his coffee cup as if to disperse the thickening air. The hum of the espresso machine behind the counter cut through the rising murmurs like a small wave. A short-haired female staff member, still drying a glass, cast a glance at Ethan before, lowering her eyes, avoiding Linda's gaze. That glance, like a faint flame, flickered in the midst of the brewing storm of injustice. Ethan did not flinch. A faint smile played at the corner of his lips, as if he were used to this brand of prejudice, dressed up as a harmless conversation. His hand tightened slightly on the chair, but his voice remained low and calm, carrying a weight that seemed to freeze the air. "Bring me the menu." His voice was gentle, but in that moment it wasn't a request. It was a reminder that the right to be served, it is not a privilege but a given. Linda narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin, sharp line. Her hand trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it by clutching the stack of receipts in her hand. A light breeze from the window carried the scent of freshly ground coffee and a hint of the midday heat. In that instant, the entire cafe seemed to freeze, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock, each tick like an invisible verdict. The air thickened, bearing the heat of eyes that quietly followed Ethan, some curious, some anxious, and some are waiting for a story whose ending had yet to be written. Linda's eyes darted around the cafe, scanning each person, searching for any sign of support. But all around, there was only silence. A few customers lowered their faces to their newspapers, while others idly stirred their coffee cups, as if they were pondering something that went far beyond the morning coffee. Ethan remained seated. His gaze was calm like a lake before a storm. He needed no protest, no threat. His composure was the strongest statement, the statement of a man who understood the value of justice and was ready to face the darkest challenges to defend it. Joe, the young waiter with a thin frame, quietly pushed open the service counter door and stepped out, his hands still warm from the espresso he had just made. In that moment, light streamed through the window, casting uneven patches on his face, patches of fear and pressure. He swallowed hard. His eyes avoided Ethan's, then muttered softly. His voice was low like a passing breeze. "Sorry, but the policy here is to serve regulars only." Each word fell like small raindrops, seemingly insignificant, yet enough to ignite a smoldering fire of doubt in the hearts of the scattered customers in the cafe. An older man holding a newspaper lowered his glasses. His eyes softened as he looked at Ethan. A young couple by the window shifted their gaze quickly from Joe to Ethan, then back to Linda, as if seeking answers to a question no one dared to ask aloud. In that moment, the air in the cafe seemed to thicken. The sound of a spoon stirring coffee tinkled on the table, like the rapid breathing of those witnessing something beyond the usual on a summer afternoon. Ethan stood up. His movements were decisive, neither slow nor rushed, as if every action had already been arranged in his mind. His gaze remained steady, but his voice rang out deep and firm, slicing through the dense silence. "I'd like to order coffee." Just 4 words, but they carried a searing heat, like a challenge to all the eyes now focused on him. A heartbeat slowed, and then everything seemed to explode. Joe froze. His hand was trembling, the espresso cup tilting a few drops of coffee, splashing onto the brown-tiled floor, forming a dark stain. Linda stood behind the counter. Her eyes were full of confusion and bewilderment. Her lips pressed tightly together, her hand clenching the stack of receipts, as if she were balancing on a tightrope between 2 abysses. A heavy sigh escaped from a corner of the room, like the cafe itself, exhaling a place where stories of justice, power, and prejudice were now being laid bare in the sunlight. Ethan gripped his phone lightly, his thumb gliding over the screen out of habit. His gaze was unwaveringly calm. Light from the window fell on his hand, creating a sharp streak of brightness, like a blade cutting through all the false words hanging in the air. Joe swallowed hard, still holding the now cold espresso cup. His eyes were fixed on the floor, as if searching for a crack to escape through. Linda stood behind the counter, her eyes wide, her breath quickening, but she dared not speak. Across the counter, another staff member stood huddled, their gaze fixed on Ethan, both fearful and admiring, a look impossible to hide. Ethan cast his gaze at Linda, a cold, resolute look that felt like a spear, aimed straight at the one who dared challenge him. He didn't say much, just one sentence, short each word, crisp and sharp: "Menu." Linda froze, her lips pressing tightly together, her face crumpling like someone just unmasked in front of a crowd. Her hand trembled as it reached for the menu on the counter but seemed unable to grasp it. A single second stretched on like an eternity, then Linda reluctantly pushed the menu toward Ethan, her eyes still averted, as if fleeing from the truth. Ethan took the menu. His hand was steady as stone. His gaze swept the cafe. Unfamiliar eyes swallowed whispers, hearts beating with a mix of fear and curiosity. In that moment, no one dared speak a word. The air felt thick, heavy with silence, and only the sound of breathing and darting eyes weaved an invisible web across the cafe. Ethan opened the menu, his eyes pausing on a single item, then lifted his gaze to Linda, his voice rising not loud, but solid as a granite block. "1 espresso." Linda's lips quivered, like someone who had just swallowed a knife. Joe stepped back. His hand was shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the now cold espresso cup. A few customers shifted nervously in their seats, as if bracing for a coming storm. The sun outside still burned fiercely, its harsh light cutting through the dusty glass, exposing the hidden truth. And in that moment, Ethan stood there, no longer just an ordinary customer, but like a people's tribunal unfolding in the middle of the cafe, where light could no longer be blocked by any curtain or pane of glass. Ethan pulled out his phone. His movements are slow but deliberate, as if every step had been meticulously calculated. Light from the window fell across his face, highlighting his determined eyes, sharp as a newly honed blade. He dialed a number. His voice was low, ringing out like a summons. "Karen, activate Protocol 7. On the other end, Karen's voice replied, cold and precise, like the click of a lock sliding into place. "Proceeding now, sir." Ethan lowered the phone, his gaze sweeping across the room, where all eyes were now drawn to him, like moths to a flame in the dark of night. He turned to face Linda standing tall, like a judge in an open-air tribunal. His gaze cold and cutting bored into Linda's panicked eyes, stripping away every illusion, swirling in her mind. "I am Ethan Carter," he said. His voice was not loud but carried far, each word striking the tiled floor like a hammer blow, shattering the fortress of Linda's falsehoods. "CEO of Sunrise Coffee House. And I'm standing in my cafe, a sharp clatter of a plate hitting the floor, cut through the air like breaking glass, shattering the frozen atmosphere. Every eye turned toward him in disbelief, some clutching the arms of their chairs, others with their hands over their mouths, as if afraid to utter a sound that might shatter their already fragile reality. Linda stood frozen like a statue that had cracked open her lips, trembling, her face pale, as if every layer of makeup could no longer conceal the fear, bleeding out inch by inch. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape, but every way out had been blocked by the truth and the power that had just been laid bare before the entire cafe. In that moment, Ethan was no longer just a customer. He was the embodiment of truth, of justice, and of strength, standing there like a living declaration that injustice would find no refuge in any shadowy corner of Sunrise Coffee House. In Linda's eyes, a faint glimmer of hope sparked like a drowning person reaching for the final lifeline. Her mouth opened, trying to shape some defense, but her voice cracked and faltered like an old, rusty iron gate being forced open. I was just following the rules. Ethan didn't let her grasp that lifeline. His eyes snapped like a whip, his voice deep and cold, echoing into every corner of the room. "Don't blame the rules when it was you who gave prejudice its voice and its look." A brief, heavy silence fell over the cafe, like a thick black curtain suffocating every breath. Linda gasped, her eyes empty, like a person stripped of every defense. Her shoulders collapsed, her hands trembled, grasping for something to hold on to in the dark. Ethan stood there, his eyes boring into her, his face carved from stone, solid and unyielding. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to raise his hand, and yet he commanded absolute silence. An elderly customer in the corner shuddered, his hand trembling as he lifted his cup of coffee, his eyes searching for answers to all that had just happened. Linda opened her mouth once more, her voice catching like someone who had just slipped off a fragile bridge. I didn't." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes flashing, his voice sharp as steel. "That's enough." Each word struck the tiled floor like a hammer blow, draining every excuse dry. The air was taut like a violin string, needing only the lightest touch to snap. Linda froze her eyes, read, her lips slightly parted, breathing heavily. Ethan lowered his voice, his eyes deep like moonlight casting down on a lake, exposing every truth. "Today, every mask has fallen." His gaze swept the room from Linda to Joe, then paused on the guests who were holding their breath. Each look carried whispers of both admiration and astonishment. And at that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath to hear the verdict. A verdict that needed no court or plea. Ethan stood tall, his shoulders radiating a quiet authority that required no show. His voice rang out deep and decisive like a hammer striking the cold tiles. "Linda Walker, you and everyone on this shift are hereby terminated effective immediately for acts of discrimination." Each word was as sharp as a blade, making Linda stiffen, her eyes blank like a shattered mirror. Her lips trembled, but no words could come out. A faint spark of light flickered in those eyes, then dimmed like an oil lamp dying out. On the other end of the line, Karen's voice came through steady and cold as a night wind. "Confirmation sent. The HR team is awaiting orders to process the staff files and revoke all system access." Joe stood behind the counter, his face pale, his hands trembling like dry branches in the wind. His eyes met Ethan's, full of bewilderment and fear, as though he had just grasped the difference between an apology and real accountability. The atmosphere in the cafe turned to stone, as if something massive had just collapsed. An elderly customer holding a cup of coffee nearly dropped it in shock. A young mother held her child close, her eyes moving from Ethan to Linda, eyes thick with questions that needed only one answer. Justice is not just words. Ethan didn't look away from Linda. His voice continued, still calm but resolute, as if every word had been written long ago. "This cafe will temporarily close for 24 hours. I will personally oversee the retraining of all staff to ensure that fairness is no longer just a slogan, but an action." A light breeze drifted in through the window, carrying the dampness of a summer rain just ended. It stirred the glasses on the counter, their clinking like a bell announcing the change to come. Linda took a breath, but that breath wasn't enough to hold on to anything. Her gaze was weary, like a fallen petal, with no trace of pride left. Ethan stood there silent but steadfast, his eyes shining with unshakable conviction. And in that moment, everyone in the cafe understood that from now on, justice would no longer be something to decorate the wall. It had stepped out present in everyday life. Ethan leaned slightly toward Linda, his voice lowered to a calm tone, but still resonant with the weight of unyielding faith. Linda, you can choose to leave in silence or to face what you have done. The difference between a fearful person and a mature one is the courage to admit their mistakes. Linda looked up at him, her eyes like two thin streaks of mist, glistening but soulless. Her chest heaved with short breaths, she trembled her lips, moved but no sound came out. Ethan didn't wait. He turned to Joe, his voice as sharp as a scalpel slicing through the facade of the young staff member. Joe, I hope you understand, being complicit in silence is also a part of the wrongdoing. This is the moment you decide which side you stand on. Joe stood there, stunned, his eyes torn between fear and a desire to make amends. A bead of sweat formed on his temple, rolling down his faded white collar. His hand clenched around the coffee cup as if searching for the last anchor. Then, like a spark igniting from the ashes, Joe took a deep breath, lifted his head to face Ethan. His eyes shone with determination, trembling but sincere. I want to make things right. A moment of silence. Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes still deep like a lake, but at the bottom of those eyes a warm spark glowed. He turned, scanning the customers who were holding their breath, and his gaze ignited a glimmer of hope. And that is why we are here, to fix, to change, to learn how to start over. A gentle breeze rustled through the wooden chairs, carrying the scent of freshly roasted coffee, mingling with the smell of damp earth after the rain. Everything seemed to whisper, rise up, make a change. Ethan took a step forward, his voice deep and resonant like a promise. Tomorrow, this place will reopen. And I want all of you both, the old staff and the customers, to see a new Sunrise Coffee House fair, compassionate, and sincere. Sighs, whispers, the sound of coffee cups placed on tables, all of it blended into a symphony of awakening. No more harsh words, no more wary glances. Instead, there were wide-open eyes heavy with thought, as if in that moment everyone had understood that justice doesn't come from declarations alone, but from the actions of ordinary people brave enough to cross the line of fear. And Ethan, CEO of Sunrise Coffee House, stood there not just as the decision-maker, but as the one who rekindled faith in a fairer tomorrow. Ethan turned, his gaze sweeping across the entire cafe, a place that had just witnessed a transformation greater than any item listed on its menu board. He looked from the customers sitting silently with their steaming cups of coffee, to the staff with their heads lowered, their hands trembling like sheets of paper caught in the wind. His voice rang out, not loud but clear enough for every person to hear. Justice is not a slogan to hang on the wall or a fancy phrase on the menu. It is how we treat every customer who walks through that door. Each word from Ethan felt like a warm breeze weaving through the thick air of doubt and confusion. A sigh rose from a corner of the cafe, as if someone had just shed an invisible burden. He paused, leaning slightly toward the staff who were still frozen, letting his eyes shine with trust and hope. If I can do that here, right here at Sunrise Coffee House, then you can do that anywhere. The rain outside tapped gently on the awning, its steady rhythm like the soundtrack to a new chapter of justice. The scent of lightly roasted coffee mingled with the damp air, a reminder that everything could begin again from the simplest of things. Ethan turned and walked away. His steps were steady but unhurried, his shoulders broad, firm, as if carrying a mission of change. And then, like a silent punctuation mark, a round of applause erupted. At first just one person, then two, then three. Each clap sparse but sincere, merging into a sound like seeds breaking the ground after a heavy rain. Customers began to lift their heads a little higher. A young mother gently squeezed her child's hand, a silent reminder of the value of justice. An elderly man set down his cup of coffee, his eyes shining with rare pride. Joe, the young barista, stood taller, as if he had just learned a lesson that life would never teach him from a book. Ethan disappeared behind the door, but his words remained like an ember smoldering in the hearts of those left behind. Ordinary but powerful, a CEO of color dressed simply but steadfast enough to face injustice. Calm can be stronger than any scream. Ethan's steady gaze exposed the harsh truth without needing to shout. Power comes from action. Ethan didn't just talk. He acted, took charge, and promised to make things right. Justice is not just a title, it is a responsibility, a commitment to change.